2 years into their marriage, Brad never suspected that something was wrong. He and his wife, Jessica, had built what he thought was a decent life together. They'd moved into a cozy house in suburban Ohio, a 2-story brick home with a small backyard where they occasionally hosted BBQs for their friends. Jessica loved hosting, or at least it seemed like she did. She'd whip up her famous potato salad, wear that white sundress that made her look effortlessly elegant, and charm their guests with witty banter and bright laughter. Brad had been smitten since the day they met, and he genuinely thought their relationship was rock solid. They didn't have children yet, but it wasn't something that had caused too much stress. They were young and had time, or at least Brad thought they did. The sex, while not as frequent as it had been in the first year of marriage, was still good. The spark was still there, at least from his perspective. Brad worked as a project manager at a construction company, so he often found himself on the road, overseeing various building sites. It wasn't unusual for him to come home late, sometimes covered in dirt, sometimes too exhausted to do more than collapse on the couch and pass out. But Jessica always seemed understanding, always greeted him with a smile and a kiss on the cheek. That was until one night when things started to feel a little off. It wasn't anything big at first. Jessica had been spending more time out of the house, often telling him she was going out with friends or to the gym. Her explanations made sense, but it felt like she was suddenly absent more often than usual. She'd come home later and later, but Brad convinced himself that it was just in his head. Then came the night that changed everything. Brad's best friend, Mike, had invited him out for drinks, saying they needed to catch up. Mike was a straightforward guy, tall, stocky, with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and a no-nonsense attitude. He'd been Brad's friend since college, and they trusted each other implicitly. So when Mike asked Brad if everything was all right between him and Jessica, Brad felt his stomach drop. "Yeah, things are fine." "Why?" Brad asked, gripping his beer tighter. Mike hesitated, looking like he was about to spill a secret that had been weighing on him for days. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but I think you need to know. One of my friends, Tim, was bragging the other night. He was talking about this woman he's been seeing. Described her in pretty specific detail." Brad raised an eyebrow. And man, it sounds exactly like Jessica." Brad's face went pale. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell are you talking about?" Mike sighed. "Tim said he's been seeing this married woman for a few months now. Said she's blonde, about 5 feet 7 inches, really into yoga, drives a silver SUV. Sound familiar?" Jessica was all of those things. Brad tried to brush it off at first. "Maybe it's just a coincidence." "Maybe," Mike said, though his tone didn't sound convinced. "But Tim described her tattoo. The small one on her ankle. You know, the butterfly." Brad's blood ran cold. That tattoo was Jessica's, no doubt about it. She'd gotten it when she was 18, a remnant of her rebellious phase. And there was no way Tim could have known about that unless he had seen it up close. The rest of that night was a blur for Brad. He drank too much, trying to drown out the growing suspicion that gnawed at his insides. Could it really be true? Could Jessica be cheating on him? For the next few days, Brad couldn't focus on anything. Work felt like a distant blur, and at home, he couldn't even look at Jessica without feeling a sickening churn in his gut. He had to know the truth. One evening, after another one of Jessica's late-night outings, Brad decided enough was enough. She came home around midnight, smelling like perfume and booze, her hair tousled in a way that set his teeth on edge. "Jessica," Brad said, his voice unusually sharp as she walked into the kitchen where he was waiting for her. She froze, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she sensed something was wrong. "What? We need to talk." "What about?" she asked, moving to grab a glass of water as if everything were perfectly normal. Brad took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "About Tim." The glass slipped out of her hand and shattered against the counter. Jessica stared at him wide-eyed, but then something unexpected happened. Instead of denying it, instead of trying to cover it up, she straightened her back, her face hardening. "Yeah," she said, her voice cold and unapologetic. "I've been sleeping with him. And not just him, Brad." For a moment, Brad thought he'd misheard her. His brain was struggling to process what she had just admitted. What are you talking about? Jessica crossed her arms, her expression turning into one of pure contempt. You heard me. It's not just Tim. There have been others. A lot of others. I'm not going to sit here and lie about it anymore. Brad felt like he'd been hit by a truck. His knees almost buckled as he leaned against the kitchen island for support. How many? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica shrugged, her tone dripping with indifference. I lost count after 8. Brad's world was collapsing around him, but Jessica wasn't done. She seemed almost amused by his reaction, as if she'd been waiting for this moment to finally be free of the charade. You really thought I was happy with you, Brad? You're boring. You come home from work, you barely talk, and then you pass out on the couch. What kind of life is that? I thought we were happy, Brad managed to choke out. Jessica let out a harsh laugh. Happy? You're delusional. I've been looking for something else for a long time. You just didn't notice. Brad's mind raced, trying to piece together everything she had just revealed. 8 men? How had she managed to hide it for so long? His hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to yell, to scream at her. But instead he asked, who else? Jessica listed the names like she was talking about people she casually knew at the gym, without a shred of guilt. There was Tim, obviously, then Scott from the gym, Jake, your coworker Adam. Oh yeah, by the way, he's way better in bed than you. There was also Tyler, the bartender at the vault, that guy Josh I met at the grocery store. Oh, and Carl, our neighbor. Brad's jaw dropped. Carl? Our next-door neighbor? The one who's married with 3 kids? Yep, Jessica said with a smirk. You'd be surprised how easy it is to seduce someone when their wife's out of town. Brad stared at Jessica as if she were a stranger. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, and his chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of everything she just said. Carl, their neighbor? He could see Carl's house through the kitchen window, where the lights were still on. The thought of the man playing with his kids, mowing the lawn, and then sneaking into bed with his wife made Brad want to vomit. Jessica, meanwhile, stood there as if she just dropped casual gossip over coffee, not the devastating truth that had torn Brad's world apart. There wasn't even a flicker of remorse in her eyes. How long? Brad's voice cracked as he forced the words out. How long have you been doing this? Jessica cocked her head to the side, as if trying to recall the exact timeline of her infidelity. Let's see. I guess it started about 6 months after we got married? Yeah, that sounds right. But honestly, it all kind of blends together after a while. 6 months. Brad whispered, his voice hoarse. 6 months? We've been married for 2 years. Yep, she said, her tone devoid of any emotion. You weren't enough, Brad. You never were. And honestly, I don't care if you hate me for it. Brad couldn't believe the audacity. He had spent 2 years of his life loving this woman, believing they were building something together, while she was out sleeping with anyone who would give her the time of day. The anger that had been simmering inside him suddenly boiled over. Why the hell didn't you just leave? He roared, slamming his fist down on the counter. Why keep pretending like everything was fine if you hated being with me so much? Jessica rolled her eyes. Because it was convenient. You paid the bills, you gave me a comfortable life. It wasn't bad to come home to a nice house, even if you were boring. The words hit Brad like a slap in the face. Convenient. He was nothing more than a safety net to her. A paycheck. Someone to come home to after she'd had her fun. Jesus Christ, Jessica. Brad's voice was shaking. Do you even realize what you've done? Do you even care? For the first time that night, Jessica's expression shifted slightly. She wasn't remorseful, but she was bored. Look, Brad, I'm not going to stand here and have a pity party with you. Yeah, I screwed around, but I don't regret it. I had fun, and you were none the wiser until now. Brad stared at her, unable to comprehend how someone could be so heartless, so completely devoid of empathy. He couldn't believe this was the same woman he'd married, the same woman he'd once thought he'd spend the rest of his life with. Now, all he could see was a stranger who had systematically destroyed their life together without a second thought. The next few days were a blur for Brad. He couldn't bring himself to go back to work, couldn't face his coworkers, especially Adam, the one who had slept with his wife. He could barely even function. He spent hours sitting in the dark, replaying every conversation, every interaction he'd had with Jessica over the past 2 years, trying to figure out how he could have missed all the signs. Mike came over to check on him, but Brad couldn't bring himself to talk about it in any more detail than he already had. He'd told Mike about Jessica's confession, but even as he said the words out loud, it still didn't feel real. Mike tried to console him, telling him that he was better off without her, that she wasn't worth the heartache, but none of it seemed to matter. Brad's life had been shattered, and he didn't know how to pick up the pieces. Then came the visit from Carl. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Brad was sitting on the porch, staring blankly at the street when Carl walked over, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Carl had always been the friendly neighbor, the kind of guy who would lend you his tools and offer you a beer when you were mowing the lawn. But now, as Brad looked at him, all he could see was betrayal. "Hey, Brad," Carl said awkwardly as he approached. "Can we talk?" Brad didn't even respond. He just glared at him, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Carl shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I know you found out about what happened with Jessica. I wanted to apologize. I never should have." "You slept with my wife," Brad interrupted, his voice low and cold. "Don't stand there and pretend like an apology is going to fix anything." Carl swallowed hard. "I know, man. I know it was wrong. It's just, I don't know, it just happened. I didn't plan on it." "Didn't plan on it?" Brad spat, standing up and facing Carl. "You didn't plan on it, but you still did it. You came into my house, you looked me in the eye, and you slept with my wife behind my back. Do you have any idea how that feels?" Carl looked down at his feet, unable to meet Brad's gaze. "I'm sorry." "You're sorry," Brad repeated, his voice rising. "You think that changes anything? You think that makes it okay?" Carl didn't answer. He just stood there, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else but in that moment. Brad's hands shook with rage, but before he could say anything else, Jessica stepped outside, her arms crossed as she looked at the two men. "Are you seriously going to stand here and argue about this like children?" she snapped, her voice laced with irritation. "It happened, Brad. Get over it." Brad turned to her, his face contorted in disbelief. "Get over it? You destroyed our marriage, Jessica. You betrayed me with God knows how many men, and you expect me to just get over it?" Jessica rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I do. Because honestly, you're acting pathetic right now. It's over. Move on." Brad was speechless. How could she be so cold, so heartless? There wasn't a single shred of guilt in her voice. No remorse. No sorrow for what she'd done. She wasn't even pretending to care. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, one of the other men involved showed up. Tyler, the bartender Jessica had mentioned, pulled up in his beat-up truck, looking equally as uncomfortable as Carl had. Tyler was a young guy, probably in his mid-20s, with a scruffy beard and a cocky swagger that had clearly charmed Jessica at some point. He walked up to the house with his hands in his pockets, glancing between Brad and Jessica as if he was walking into a war zone. Hey," he mumbled awkwardly. "Can I talk to you for a sec, Brad?" Brad's patience had hit its limit. "No," he snapped. "Get the hell out of here." Jessica, however, seemed amused by the whole situation. "Why don't you stay, Tyler? I'm sure Brad would love to hear about the time we—" "Shut up," Brad roared, cutting her off before she could finish her sentence. He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with fury. "You've done enough." Brad's outburst was the first sign of life he'd shown in days. The raw emotion, the volcanic eruption of anger, finally broke through the fog of betrayal. Jessica smirked, her lips curling up in that cold, condescending way that made Brad's skin crawl. "Oh, did I hit a nerve?" she taunted, leaning against the porch railing. "Guess I forgot to mention a few more things." Brad's heart raced, his mind screaming for this nightmare to end. But his mouth moved without his permission. "What more could you possibly have to say, Jessica? What else could you throw in my face?" She arched an eyebrow, clearly enjoying his torment. Well, since we're laying everything out there, you should know I didn't stop at 8. It wasn't just Tim, Scott, Carl, Adam, Tyler. There were a few more after that. I had a thing with Jake's brother, Steve. He was way more fun at those BBQs than you. And don't forget about Mitch. Remember that conference you went to in Vegas? Yeah, while you were gone, Mitch and I had a little staycation right here. That was fun. Brad felt like he was going to throw up. Each name was like a dagger to his chest, twisting and turning, digging deeper. He could barely stand up straight, his world spinning out of control. Tyler stood awkwardly by, not knowing where to look or what to say. Carl was frozen, his face pale, knowing his name had already been dragged into this hellish confession. How could you? Brad whispered, more to himself than to her. His voice was fragile, barely holding on to the last thread of sanity. Jessica shrugged nonchalantly, as if she were talking about something as mundane as a grocery list. You just weren't enough, Brad. You never were. I got bored. I wanted more and you didn't even notice. So I took it. Brad's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. His voice was shaking with a fury he had never known before. You're a monster. Jessica laughed, the sound cruel and mocking. A monster? Please, I'm just honest. You're the one who's been living in a fantasy. Tyler, sensing that he had somehow walked into a war zone, slowly started backing away, mumbling, yeah, I think I should go. No, Brad barked, his voice sharp and commanding. You stay. I want to hear it. I want to hear what she's told you. Tyler froze, unsure of how to respond. He looked at Jessica, who rolled her eyes and waved dismissively. Oh, relax, Brad. Tyler's not going to give you some heartwarming confession. He didn't care about you. None of them did. Tyler cleared his throat nervously. Look, man, I didn't know it was like this. I mean, I knew she was married, but she said it was different, that you two weren't really together like that anymore. Brad's eyes narrowed. What do you mean, like that? Tyler shifted uncomfortably. She made it sound like you guys were basically roommates, like you weren't really in love anymore, that she was free to do whatever. Brad turned to Jessica, his anger bubbling up again. Is that what you told them? That we were nothing but roommates? Jessica shrugged again, as if she couldn't care less. It's not far from the truth. You and I, we were done a long time ago, Brad. You just didn't realize it. I've been living my life and you've been living yours. It was convenient. That word again, convenient. It echoed in Brad's mind like a cruel joke. Their marriage had been nothing but a convenience for her, a facade to cover up the fact that she was living a double life. And he, blind to it all, had been playing the part of the devoted husband. Tyler, sensing the tension escalating, took a step back, muttering something about needing to leave. But before he could slip away, another unexpected figure arrived. Adam, Brad's coworker, the one who had also been sleeping with Jessica. Brad? Adam began, looking genuinely remorseful, his face a mixture of guilt and shame. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Brad's rage exploded. You didn't mean for it to happen? You're my coworker, Adam. We've worked side by side for years. How could you sleep with my wife and then face me every day at the office like nothing was wrong? Adam's face twisted in pain. I know it was messed up. I don't have an excuse. Jessica came on to me, and I was weak. Jessica snorted from the porch. Weak? More like desperate. Don't flatter yourself, Adam. You were just convenient too. The use of that word again set something off inside Brad. His vision blurred with rage as he lunged toward Adam, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt. You coward, Brad snarled. You couldn't even face me and tell me the truth. You let me sit there, day after day, while you screwed my wife behind my back. Adam didn't fight back. He just stood there, his face pale as Brad's grip tightened. I'm sorry, Adam whispered. I really am. But Brad didn't want apologies. He wanted answers. He wanted to know how his life had become this twisted nightmare. Brad finally released Adam, shoving him away with disgust. His chest heaved with anger and hurt, his mind a swirl of betrayal and disbelief. His life had crumbled in the span of just a few days, and he felt powerless to stop it. Jessica, on the other hand, stood on the porch, casually observing the chaos she had created. She looked almost amused by the way Brad's world was unraveling, as if she were watching a drama unfold on TV rather than the destruction of her marriage. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Brad turned to her, his hands trembling. "Why are you like this? Why are you so cruel?" Jessica's face hardened, her expression turning cold. "Cruel? I'm just honest, Brad. You couldn't handle the truth. I'm not some sweet little housewife, and I never was. I wanted excitement, passion, freedom. And you? You couldn't give me any of that." Brad shook his head, disbelief still clouding his mind. "So what now? You expect me to just walk away and leave you to keep doing this? To keep sleeping with every guy who looks your way?" Jessica smiled wickedly. "Why not? You're not stopping me. You never could." Brad's entire body shook with anger, but he knew there was nothing left to say. Jessica wasn't going to change. She wasn't going to apologize or feel any guilt for what she'd done. She was who she was: selfish, deceitful, and completely void of remorse. But before Brad could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Enough!" It was Carl, who had been standing quietly by, watching the whole scene unfold. He stepped forward, his face set in a grim expression. "Jessica, you've done enough damage. You need to leave." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so now you're the hero, Carl? Don't forget. You were part of this too." Carl's face flushed with guilt. "Yeah, I was, but it's over now." The tension in the air thickened as Carl's words hung over the porch. For a moment, everyone stood still, uncertain of what would happen next. Jessica's eyes narrowed as she studied Carl, her lips twisting into a sneer. "You're acting like you're any better than the rest of them," she scoffed. "Don't pretend you suddenly grew a conscience just because Brad's standing here." Carl's jaw tightened, and for the first time that night, he looked genuinely ashamed. His normally calm demeanor had been shattered by Jessica's venomous tongue, and the guilt was written all over his face. He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for what he was about to say next. "Jessica, I'm not pretending to be a saint. I made a mistake, a huge one, but I'm not going to let you destroy Brad any more than you already have," Carl said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. Brad, who had been standing frozen with anger and disbelief, turned to Carl, his confusion evident. "What do you mean, let her destroy me more? What else is there?" Carl hesitated, glancing at Jessica. She gave him a mocking grin, her eyes daring him to spill the rest of the truth. Brad's heart raced. He had thought that the worst was already behind him, that hearing about Jessica's affairs with multiple men had been the final blow. But there was something else, something darker. Carl sighed, running a hand through his hair before he looked directly at Brad. "There's more, Brad, and it's about the money." Jessica let out a dry laugh, folding her arms across her chest. "Oh, so now we're getting to that part, huh? Finally growing a spine, Carl?" Brad's stomach dropped. The money? He suddenly remembered the strange withdrawals from their joint account a few months ago, amounts that Jessica had shrugged off as shopping expenses. He hadn't questioned it at the time. Why would he? He trusted her. But now, what about the money? Brad asked slowly, his voice laced with suspicion. Carl swallowed hard. "She's been using your accounts, Brad. Not just for shopping or normal expenses, but to cover some personal things. Vacations, hotel rooms. I found out when she asked me to lie to you about where some of the money went. And then there's Mitch, the guy you met at the conference in Vegas. He wasn't just a fling. He's been taking a cut from your accounts, too." Jessica set it all up. Brad felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He turned to Jessica, eyes wide in disbelief. "You've been stealing from me? From us?" Jessica's smile grew even wider, her eyes gleaming with something almost resembling pride. "Stealing? I wouldn't call it that. I call it compensating myself for all the time I wasted being your wife. I took what I deserved." Brad's head spun, his mind struggling to keep up with the revelations crashing down around him. The affairs were one thing, a devastating betrayal of trust. But the money? She had been siphoning off funds behind his back, using their savings for her own selfish whims, for years. And Mitch had been part of this? He thought he had met him by chance at the conference, a friendly guy sharing drinks at the bar. But now it seemed like Mitch was another player in Jessica's twisted game. "I can't believe this," Brad whispered, his voice barely audible. "You've been using me this whole time. For money, for whatever you wanted. And I didn't even see it." Jessica tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. "Of course you didn't. You were too busy being the perfect little husband, oblivious to what was really going on." Brad's fists clenched at his sides. "You're unbelievable." Before anyone could react, a new voice cut through the tension. A voice Brad didn't recognize at first. "I think it's time everyone got out of here." Brad turned to see a tall man standing at the end of the driveway, his broad frame silhouetted by the streetlight. He had dark hair, a serious expression, and a suit that looked too well-tailored for this suburban chaos. Jessica's face instantly darkened. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered under her breath. The man stepped closer, his face becoming clearer in the porch light. "Hello, Jessica. Been a while." Brad's confusion deepened. "Who the hell is this?" he asked, his eyes darting between the newcomer and Jessica. Jessica groaned, visibly annoyed. "This is Tom," she said through gritted teeth. "He's from my past." "From her past," Tom said, a humorless smile on his face. "You could say that. I'm her ex-husband." Brad's heart stopped. Ex-husband? He had no idea Jessica had been married before him. She had never mentioned an ex-husband, never talked about any serious relationships before him, except a couple of casual dating stories she'd mentioned in passing. Tom walked up the steps to the porch, his gaze never leaving Jessica. "I heard about the mess you've been causing, Jess. I came by to warn Brad here before you took him for everything, like you did to me." Brad's mind was spinning, trying to process this latest revelation. "You were married before?" Jessica rolled her eyes, clearly irritated by Tom's arrival. "Yes, Brad. I was married before. It didn't work out." "So what? So what?" Brad repeated, his voice rising. "You never told me. You've been lying about everything, haven't you?" Tom turned to Brad, his face serious. "She's been pulling this stunt for years. Suck a guy dry emotionally and financially, then move on to the next one. She did it to me, and she's doing it to you." Brad felt the room closing in on him. "How much did she take from you?" Tom's eyes darkened. "Nearly everything. By the time I figured it out, she drained my accounts and left me with nothing." Jessica shrugged as if the conversation bored her. "Oh please, Tom. You were easy. Just like Brad here." Brad's world was collapsing piece by piece. He had thought the affairs were the worst of it, but now it was clear that Jessica had been playing him for a fool since the beginning. She had used him for his money, his stability, and when she got bored, she'd moved on to the next victim. And now, with Tom standing here, it became clear that this was a pattern. A cycle she'd repeated again and again. Brad stared at Jessica, the weight of everything finally crashing down on him. His marriage, his love, his trust. It had all been a lie. Every day, every memory, had been tainted by her deceit. And now, standing here with Carl, Adam, Tyler, and her ex-husband, he realized that he had been nothing more than a pawn in Jessica's twisted game. "You're sick," Brad said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're a parasite." Jessica smiled, an icy glint in her eyes. "If you think that bothers me, Brad, you're more naive than I thought." Tom stepped forward, his voice hard and unyielding. "Jessica, you're going to leave now. You've done enough damage." For a moment, something flickered in Jessica's eyes. Anger, maybe. But then she sighed dramatically and picked up her purse from the porch railing. "Fine. I'm bored anyway." Without another word, Jessica walked past them, her heels clicking on the pavement as she headed down the driveway. Brad watched her go, feeling both numb and shattered. His marriage was over. His life as he knew it had been destroyed. The echo of Jessica's heels slowly faded as she disappeared into the night, leaving behind a hollow silence. Brad stood there, numb, unable to move or speak, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. The love of his life, the woman he had devoted himself to, had not only betrayed him with multiple men but had used him as a means to fund her escapades. And now, it turned out she had a history of doing this to others, Tom, her ex-husband, being her previous victim. For a moment, no one said anything. The air was thick with tension, discomfort, and the remains of Brad's shattered reality. He felt the weight of every lie, every moment of deception, pressing down on him. His head swirled with questions. How long had she been planning this? How could I have missed it? How did I let myself become this blind? Finally, Carl broke the silence, his voice quiet and filled with regret. Brad, man, I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know it would get this bad. Brad turned to look at Carl, his expression blank, his eyes hollow. You knew, Brad said, his voice devoid of emotion. You knew she was sleeping with other men, and you said nothing. Carl's face twisted in shame. I thought it was just a fling, you know? I didn't know she was this deep into it. I thought she'd get bored and stop. Brad scoffed, bitterness filling his voice. Get bored? She's been bored for years, Carl. She was never here. She was just using me. Adam, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. Brad, we all messed up. I should have said something too. But Jess, she has a way of manipulating people, making them think things aren't as bad as they are. Brad's hands tightened into fists, the anger simmering under the surface again. He felt trapped between rage and devastation, not knowing which emotion to focus on. You're all cowards, Brad spat, his voice shaking with fury. You watched as she tore apart my life, and you did nothing. You let her walk all over me. Carl tried to step forward, his hand outstretched as if to offer comfort, but Brad quickly recoiled. Don't, Brad warned, his voice low and dangerous. I don't need your apologies. Tom, who had been silent up until now, cleared his throat. Brad, I know this is hard to hear, but she's gone now. You need to start thinking about what comes next. Brad turned to him, his eyes narrowing. What comes next? How do you come back from something like this? How do you fix your life when it's been completely destroyed? Tom sighed, his face reflecting the pain of someone who had been through this before. You rebuild. It's slow. It's painful. But you get through it. Took me a long time after Jessica ruined my life, but I made it. You can too. Brad shook his head, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. The betrayal wasn't just about the affairs or the money. It was the trust. The way Jessica had stripped him of every bit of confidence and dignity he had left. I don't know if I can, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. Tom stepped closer, his hand resting on Brad's shoulder. You can. You have to. Brad took a deep breath, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. He glanced back at the house, the home that had once felt like a sanctuary, now a hollow shell filled with memories tainted by lies. How was he supposed to go back inside, knowing everything that had happened? How was he supposed to sleep in that bed, eat in that kitchen, live in that space, when it was all a reminder of how blind he had been? I need to get out of here, Brad said suddenly, his voice urgent. I can't stay in this house. Not right now. Carl, still looking guilty, nodded quickly. I've got an extra room at my place, Brad. You can crash there for as long as you need. Brad gave Carl a hard look, the betrayal still fresh in his mind. But then he sighed, too tired to argue. Fine, he muttered, just for tonight. As Brad moved to leave the porch, Tyler finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. Brad, man, I know I screwed up, but I'm really sorry. Brad didn't even look at him. Save it, he muttered, walking past him. He couldn't handle more apologies right now. They meant nothing. The drive to Carl's house was silent, the car filled with the heavy tension of everything unsaid. Brad stared out the window, his mind replaying every moment of his marriage, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. He thought about the early days with Jessica, the way she had laughed at his jokes, the way she had looked at him with admiration and affection. Was any of it real, or had it all been an act? Carl glanced at Brad from the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "I know you're mad, Brad, and you have every right to be, but I hope one day you can forgive me." Brad didn't respond. He wasn't sure he had forgiveness in him anymore. Every part of him felt raw and exposed, as if the entire world had been conspiring against him. His wife, his friends, even his co-workers, they had all known pieces of the truth, and none of them had told him. He had been the last to know about his own life. When they finally arrived at Carl's house, Brad stepped out of the car and stood in the driveway, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. He looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling above him, indifferent to his pain. For a moment, he felt utterly alone in the universe. Carl led him inside, offering him a drink, but Brad shook his head. "I just need to sleep," he muttered. Carl pointed him toward the guest room, and Brad headed inside, collapsing onto the bed without bothering to undress. His mind was too exhausted to think anymore, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jessica's smirking face, heard her mocking words. "You were never enough." Brad clenched his fists, his body tense with anger. How could she say that? After everything they had been through together, how could she reduce him to nothing more than a convenience in her life? He thought of all the times he had tried to make her happy. The vacations, the nights out, the thoughtful gifts. None of it had mattered to her. She had always been looking for something more, something he couldn't give her. And then there was the money she had stolen, siphoned off bit by bit, while he was too blind to notice. It wasn't just the financial loss that hurt, it was the principle. She had taken everything from him, and she hadn't even cared. Brad rolled over, staring at the ceiling, wondering how his life had come to this. He had thought he was building a future with Jessica, but now that future was nothing more than ash. The next morning, Brad awoke with a heavy heart. He felt like a stranger in his own life, unsure of where to go or what to do next. Carl had already left for work, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that read, "Take your time. Stay as long as you need." Brad sat at the table, staring at the note, wondering if he would ever be able to trust anyone again. Carl had been his friend for years, but now even that friendship felt tainted by betrayal. As Brad sat there, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Tom. "Brad, I know it's hard right now, but you need to talk to a lawyer. Jessica's going to try to come after you for more. Trust me, I've been through this before." Brad sighed, feeling the weight of that truth settle over him. He had no choice but to fight back now. Jessica wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. If he didn't act quickly, she would take whatever was left of his dignity, his finances, and his peace of mind. With a heavy heart, Brad picked up the phone and dialed the number for a lawyer, realizing that his battle was far from over.